It's the start of week 10 in the FTC DECODE season. You need a plan, and I got you covered. I'm Coach Pratt, and I've been teaching robotics and design for over a decade now. By the end of today's video, you and your team should have a plan for what your build team should be focusing on, your program team, and your outreach team so that you can help find a little more success this season in the DECODE. The main goal for this week is code tuning and some sort of next-gen prototyping and some getting ready for your first competition. For your build team, last week, you should have hopefully finished off your first competition robot for your first qualifier, whatever that first competition ends up being. And you should have handed that off to programmers. At this point, you're really only repairing anything that may have broken on the robot, but you're not building anything new on the current competition robot. That sort of build freeze on the first qualifier robot is done on purpose so that your programmers have time to work with a consistent machine, and then they can program things related to that specific setup and that specific orientation of all your different sub-mechanisms. But that doesn't mean that as a build team that your job is done. Because now it's your turn to start looking towards the future and start saying, okay, if we make it through to the next qualifying round, or the next round, be that regional championships, be that a super regional, depending on how it is your tournament is set up, we need to be making some upgrades to our robot. You should have had enough time at this point to take a look at your programmers and say, all right, what is working well in the robot and what could be improved? Do we need to add an intake for a robot if we don't have one yet? Do we need to improve our transfer mechanism from that intake to that shooter? Do I want to use a dual shooter? Do I want to have two flywheels? Now's the time to start thinking about some different iterative designs that you could be using on your current robot. Do you want to have some sort of indexing, some sort of color sensing on your robot so that it's capable of knowing and being able to fire some of those patterns? Because perhaps you weren't focusing on the patterns for that motif, or it's not a motif, for the patterns on that DECODE scale at the end of teleop and at the end of autonomous. Now might be the time to start thinking about some strategies to move towards competing successfully in that. So the reason we start doing this now is it's going to give you an upgrade path, and you already have some modular designs you can improve upon for the next section. Maybe you find this week that things are starting to break on your current qualifying robot. Now's the time to go back and improve those. Make certain sections of your CAD thicker, add in less friction for your joints, add in some bearings where you may not have considered that they were needed initially, change some of your tolerances. This is the time to go through and test some of these prototypes. Now they're actually starting to go through and test this. It may not end up being a complete subsystem overhaul, but it could end up being a subsystem overhaul. And that's possible. And because hopefully you have two different robots you've been working on, you can start testing these out on that other prototype robot as you had just handed off that competition robot to your other team. Again, that's an ideal world, but if you're designing these in modular design, it's totally possible that you could be working on individual chunks and individual components of subsystems and testing those out to see if they've improved above your initial subsystems, even without another competition robot. Coming over to the programming team, this is really your week to shine. As well as last week, this week, and next week are your kind of main weeks to make sure that all that kind of boiler prototype code that you've been creating up to this point actually works and functions as you'd expect. So for your autonomous, with your Roadrunner or Pedro pathing, or if you're using your own custom pathing, or if you're using pathing at all, you've got your pathing tuned last week, so you can actually start drawing out and building some of your autonomous routines. Some things you may want to consider is that you might end up clashing with another robot. In previous FTC seasons, there's a lot more discrete sections for where robots should go, but in this season, it's a lot less clear as to where robots are. So it might be beneficial to write up multiple autonomous paths. So we know that we have 3 lanes within your So looking at our autonomous section, let's assume that you're on the blue team right now. If you start your robot here and you other start your robot there, you can kind of see that there are 2 kind of distinct lanes that you could walk inside. So you may want to consider one autonomous path that allows you to go in the outside lane and move up, and another autonomous path that allows you to stay to the inside lane. And the reason I suggest this is that if your teammate does not have the ability and they've only programmed just one autonomous path, by having 2 autonomous paths running and capable, or even maybe 3, one from the back and one from the front, it allows you to be a lot more adaptable to what your alliance partner's autonomous path is. What's happened in previous seasons, like in the Into Deep season, if both robots in the same alliance were a sample robot, you really only got the chance to run one autonomous for them. And that is a recipe for missing out on points. So my suggestion would be to have a couple different paths that you can create, maybe 2, maybe 3 different paths, looking at the inside and the outside lanes. So depending on what your alliance partner is doing, you won't end up running into your alliance partner, and you will both be able to use your autonomous together at the same time. It's a good time this week, kind of switching gears, is to talk to your drive team and say, okay, I'm going to test this and I want you to drive the robot around and teleop. Tell me what you think about these current designs. It's a good time to start putting in autonomous routines into the driver section. If you have some sort of indexer, maybe one button always fires the green ball and one button always fires the purple ball. Maybe you have a section where the ball is not allowed to fire out of the flywheel until it's at a current RPM. Maybe you add in an RGB LED indicator so that you can tell your driver, hey, when it's green, the flywheel is up to speed and you can launch this out. Maybe as the driver is driving around, they can hold the button to be able to fire. And then once the turret or the robot has rotated to the angle that it needs to be able to locate on that goal, and the flywheel is at that certain RPM within your tolerance, then the ball will automatically fire as long as a button is held down. So you want to think about, how can I make my driver's life easier by using automations in the teleop phase? If the driver has to do this all manually, it's going to end up being a bit of a recipe for disaster. Well, maybe not a recipe for disaster, but your driver's going to have a much harder time trying to think about, okay, is my flywheel actually up to speed? Do I know if my flywheel is up to speed? Giving any sort of registers to your driver is always a great idea, and it makes life so much simpler on your driver. So that's your main goal, is testing some of those pathings, maybe creating multiple different paths for your autonomous, and then working with your drivers to make sure that things are clear for them, adding in some notes, adding in some visual cues, adding in vibration off the controller so that they know when things are ready to rock. You can even add in some telemetry sections so that the driver hub is telling notes. So maybe there's a second driver that is there listening and looking at the data that's popping up on telemetry so they can let the driver know, hey, it's time to fire, or whatever have you. For the outreach team, this is when you should be working on some sort of formal pit presentation. You have 10 minutes total, 5 minutes as a practice, or not as 5 minutes, 5 minutes to explain your ideas and your journey over the season, and then 5 minutes for a Q&A. It would be a good time to start flushing out what that 5 minutes might look like and start thinking about what kind of things do you want to focus on. You should really focus on, I'm personally a fan of focusing on the strengths of your team. So if you have, and you're gunning for the Inspire Award, you need to have one strong contender in the Robot Design Awards, and you need to have one strong contender in the Team Attributes Award. So if it were me, I would focus your efforts stronger on one of those 3 that you think your team best suits inside of those 3 sections. Of course, it's strong to be well-rounded and overall, and doesn't mean you ignore the other awards, but it does mean that I think you're going to find more benefit out of focusing on one of those 3 out of each of those subcategories, and of course, the Think Award. It's a good time if you're going to have any sort of pit materials, be it a display, be it some sort of design, be it some sort of journey over your season. For this first qualifier, now's a good time to start creating some of those initial prints, so you can send them off to the print shop if you want that, so they can have it ready in time, because larger posters, larger flags, larger vinyl signs take more time to print than just a standard sheet of A4 paper or letter paper. Another suggestion is to work on your first final draft of your engineering portfolio. You're only about 3 weeks away from the end of your competition, which means you can start setting out what you want your portfolio to look like. My suggestion is, because there's 7 awards and you get 15 pages, one of them is a cover page, try to focus 2 pages per award. If you want to lean into that idea of your strengths and which of those 3 specific awards you've done more effort on or feel your team has a better chance of winning, you could do 2.5 or even 3 pages on that one award from each of those categories that you think is strong, and then half a page or even 1 page for some of those awards you feel you have a weaker background in, or weaker evidence of your learning in. Once you've got that kind of finalized, make sure you're talking to your build team, your programmer team, make sure you're giving notes. Hopefully you've got notes from them in the previous weeks so that you can find some success moving forward. So that's my suggestions on these goals for this week. It's sort of your code tuning, your portfolio setup, and that kind of next-gen prototyping. If you're looking for some more resources and help in robotics, you can consider joining the community down below. Let me know in the comments how your team is doing this week. How do you feel getting up and ready for your first competition? Or maybe you've already had your first competition, and hopefully that's gone out well for you. Otherwise, I wish you the best of luck out there this robotics season.